Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. By way of introduction, my name is David Nye. I'm the Major Airports Manager for the Australian Airports Association. For technical assistance this morning, please phone Redback Support on 1800 733 416. And if you'd like to listen to this webinar through your phone instead, please dial the number and passcode that's listed in the chat box. Today, the AAA presents its second webinar for 2018. And the topic is developing a drone strategy for regional airports, and is presented by Keith Tonkin, Managing Director and Principal Consultant of Aviation Projects. Today's webinar will cover the following topics: what is a drone, what drones can do now and also in the future, operational requirements and limitations, opportunities for airports, and feasibility and implementation. The opportunity to ask Keith questions will also be provided. To ask him a question, please use the chat box, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen, just to the right of the cogwheel. After typing out your question, hit enter to submit. Keith will address questions at the end, but if there's something specific regarding what he's talking about at the time, he may answer at the time. Before we start, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Keith for his participation today. And without further ado, the webinar will commence. So over to Keith.
Thanks, David, and welcome everybody to this webinar about drones. It's an interesting topic that we are addressing today because there's a lot of interest in the industry and in the market to be able to use drones and ultimately to make some money out of them. And we're seeing that more and more as we work with airports, but also larger organisations like regional councils, local governments, state governments and the Commonwealth to try and attract investment to further the development of drone technology and to find some real and practical uses for them. So today is directed towards airports specifically to understand how we can adopt, promote and manage drone operations at and near airports now and in the future. So there are two parts to it. One of them is how to operate drones for the purpose of good at the airport, how to manage drones that are not used for the purpose of good by others, and then also how to attract investment that allows compatible use of drones in and around the airport. We'll talk about what is a drone, very broadly speaking. We want to talk about how they can be used, what purposes can they be put, what are the requirements and limitations about how they're operated, and then in terms of opportunities, some of the risks and hazards associated with their use, and talk about some countermeasures. In a way, we talk about aerodrome safeguarding, and the latest frontier in aerodrome safeguarding for us when we're speaking about it is drones. They're kind of like a wildlife hazard, but they're not wildlife, obviously. And then finally, in terms of the strategic approach to attracting investment, we'll talk very quickly at the end about feasibility and implementation of a strategy to attract drone operators and investment. So what is a drone? Now, in the regulations, we're talking about the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations Part 101 in Australia. We talk about remotely piloted aircraft, RPAs, and remotely piloted aircraft systems, RPAs. Commonly, they're called drones, and broadly speaking, it's an unmanned aerial vehicle or system. It's a thing that flies through the air without a pilot in it. And whilst most of them are operated by someone with controls, there's work underway in various guises to operate drones autonomously for all sorts of different uses. So when we're talking about drones, it's more of a common term for a remotely piloted aircraft or an unmanned aerial vehicle. So how are they being used? All sorts of uses, and I guess it's like the internet of things. As it developed, more uses were found for it, and we're seeing the same with drones. They're used for military, law enforcement and border control. The military have been using drones or remotely piloted aircraft for a long time now, and the technology is well and truly proved, and more work is going towards how to operate drones where people would be in harm's way, and specifically for the purpose of controlling borders and military activities. There's more and more work being directed towards upgrading the capacity to carry a load and the range or endurance of a drone to be able to carry out surveillance or carry loads for disaster management. We're seeing drones being used for search and rescue. We saw the little ripper down at the Gold Coast where someone was saved by a drone that dropped a life preserver to a person in the water. And so that's a really great practical example of how a drone can be used to carry out something that was hard to do or more costly to be done by a helicopter or some other aircraft type. The popular use we're seeing in all sorts of different ways is shipping and delivery of goods, and we know that Amazon and Google Prime and Uber Elevate are all working hard towards achieving that, and we've got a couple of short videos to show in a minute about that shipping and delivery capability. In agriculture, we're seeing a lot of drones being used to monitor crops with all the different sensors that they carry, and one of the big challenges that we're seeing in that sort of use is the amount of data that's collected and needs to be transmitted and analysed. We also know that drones are being used in aerial filming and photography, so whenever we can mount a camera or a sensor on a drone, it can be used for something useful. In terms of the capabilities, we all know that the retail drones can fly around and take videos, and we've seen the quality of the video has improved and the ability to capture video in different ways has improved, and the cost has reduced progressively over time as well. And so we've got different generations of drone technology described here, and really we're at the point now where drones are being put to commercial uses. Whilst there's some development underway, we know that there are practical and cost-effective uses for drones. We know that there's still work underway to improve the regulatory environment, and every country around the world is working hard to ensure that the commercial use of drones or the practical use of drones can be accommodated within a safe operating environment. So we're seeing changes to standards improve. We're seeing automated safety modes. We've got drones that will automatically land if there's some problem with their control systems or their navigation or their link back to the controller. We know that we can apply geofencing to prevent them from going places where they shouldn't go. We're seeing improvements in the way that payload can be connected or lifted, and more work is underway. We know that drones are becoming more and more intelligent in the way that they understand where they are, and they can sense and avoid objects, obstacles, other drones or aircraft. And we know, for example, that Boeing has just signed an agreement with the Queensland state government to set up an establishment in Queensland to investigate autonomous drone operations. So that's where we are at the moment. And then in the future, I've got a picture there of the EHang person carrier, which is a drone. It's just big enough to carry a person inside it. And we know that Airbus is working hard to create something similar, and we know that other big companies around the world are working very hard to create autonomous drones that will carry people and heavy loads. They're commercially suitable. They fit within air traffic management systems. They can interchange payloads. They've got a level of reliability that means that we can put people in them and not be too concerned about their safety. And we know that the idea that is being proposed for implementation in Dubai is that I could walk up to one of these air taxis, if you like, and hop in and tell it where I wanted to go, and then it would take off autonomously and fly me there and land safely at the other end. So that's the future. That's where people are working very hard towards right now. And it won't be long before we'll see that in action in our country either. When we talk about operational requirements in Australia, we're referencing Civil Aviation Safety Regulations Part 101. And the way it's been set up in the most recent amendment to those regulations, there are excluded operations, and they are specific to a certain set of conditions, which I'll explain. And then other than that, included RPAs or remotely piloted aircraft have to operate as per the regulations and be operated by someone who has proper training and a certificate and a remote pilot license, and be subject to certain other scrutiny by the regulator. In terms of the different types of remotely piloted aircraft, we've got micro RPAs, very small, and they can be operated under those standard operating conditions. Very small, up to 2 kilos, and they can be operated in a commercial operation or others under the standard operating conditions. And then once we get over 2 kilograms, basically, unless they're under very specific requirements, they must meet all of the operating regulations as well. And so where we're operating those small RPA for sport, recreational purposes, or under training or experience, or the Landholder Rule, then they must meet all those other requirements about having to be properly trained and licensed and have an operating certificate. Then once we get over 25 kilograms, and if you think about how heavy that would be, that's a pretty substantial remotely piloted aircraft or drone. And up to 150 kilos, that's a very substantial aircraft. And over 150 kilograms, they're essentially an aircraft for the purpose of certification and airworthiness requirements, as well as the operating requirements. So the excluded RPAs, what it means to airports is that they must remain below 120 metres or 400 feet. They are not allowed to operate within 3 nautical miles of a controlled aerodrome, and they're not to be flown within certain areas in and around an aerodrome. Now, this image here I'm showing you is straight from the advisory circular, 101-10, and it shows where RPAs can and can't be operated. The only caveat to that requirement is that where CASA allows it, or where there is a controlled aerodrome, if the Air Traffic Control Service or Air Service Australia permits the operation of those drones within the airspace. So you would, if you had an ALA or a registered or certified aerodrome that didn't have an Air Traffic Control Service, then these are the restrictions applicable to you, unless there is an approval from CASA to do so. And the question would be, well, why would we want to operate a drone inside our airspace? And we'll think about a few of those in a minute, but essentially there are some good reasons why drones can be used at airports. And so we'll take you through those standard operating conditions, where they can and can't be operated, and then talk about how to go about getting those approvals. So at airports, it's an included RPA. We need CASA's authorisation at a non-controlled aerodrome, and at a controlled aerodrome we also need Air Services Australia. And those RPAs need to be operated by someone with a remote pilot operator certificate or have a license to do so. There's another peculiarity about the Landholder Rule, and that is in relation to the size of the RPA, where the RPA is being operated over whoever has the right to occupy that site with their approval for the purpose of aerial spotting or photography or agricultural operations, then that can be done. So if you've got a farm or some sort of property next to the airport where those conditions are met, then the operator would be able to operate subject to the requirements of the previous drawing that I showed you, which shows the space where drones are excluded, which is that one there. So at airports, why are we using them? We're talking about aerial communications or retransmission. We could be carrying cargo, and I think that's one for the future. We talk about integrated transport hubs, where we might have train, we might have cars, vehicles on the ground. We might also have drones carrying people out from an airport to wherever they might go to, just the same as they would via a taxi. And there's certain conditions on the operation of those drones where the pilot doesn't receive direct reward or compensation for that operation. But generally speaking, these are the opportunities for airports. We know that these are being done already, subject to certain approvals. They're being used for pavement inspections. There's a great idea that's been bandied around for some time that we can use drones for conducting perimeter fence inspections, particularly where it's difficult to get a vehicle, or if there's been rain or flooding or some other hazardous situation, a drone can go out and do that. And send information back to us. We know that drones can be used for building inspections or inspecting towers or other tall structures. We know that drones are being used for conducting aerial survey. So rather than doing 10-metre square topographic survey with an instrument, a drone can fly over and cover much more ground, much faster than people on the ground can, albeit subject to certain data accuracy limits. We can use drones if there are obstruction lights in and around the aerodrome, then a drone will be good for conducting those sort of inspections. I've got an example where a drone is being used for wildlife deterrence, and we also know that drones can be used for collecting or seeing things like weather data or other environmental conditions. So in terms of, we talked about what are the opportunities for airports. Operationally, we think there are some opportunities for airports to save money by using drones rather than people. And here are some examples where we're using drones for imaging pavements. They can do that much faster and capture that data and get better positions to take that imagery than a person could potentially on a vehicle on the ground. We've also seen that's an example there of a drone being operated in the US to image a part of the pavement. And there's another example of it. So that's a pretty valuable piece of information, whether it's the line marking or where the cracks are on the aerodrome. So for the purpose of trend monitoring, that sort of information is very valuable and much easier to gather using a drone. In terms of what we talk about wildlife hazard management, I've got an example here of a drone being used to scare birds away. That's what it looks like. In terms of risks and hazards, so the good thing, as I said, was drones can be used for the power of good, but there are hazards associated with their operation, and generally where it's being conducted by someone other than people interested in safe operations. And so there's potential for congestion of airspace. Safety risks arise from collision risk more than anything, and disruption of operations, which is something that no one wants. And I've got an example of a drone that didn't impact. It was hit by a larger aircraft and interrupted operations at Heathrow. And then we've got another one, an example to follow this about Dubai, which also had airspace shut down several times. So if we could just watch that video now. Now this video is an animated video rather than an actual one, so it's as interpreted by people.
A British Airways flight bound for London took off from Geneva on Sunday morning. The Airbus A320 was approaching Heathrow Airport around noon when a drone hit the front of the plane. The aircraft landed safely. None of the 132 passengers and 5 crew members were injured. There have been 6 reported incidents of drones being flown at UK airports since August 2015, 4 of which were serious near misses. Flying a drone near airports is not allowed by the Civil Aviation Authority. It's also a criminal offense to endanger the safety of an aircraft in flight.
So the issue with drones, the smaller ones which are allowed to operate in and around aerodromes, the less than 100 grams, are probably not going to make much of a difference. But the larger RPAs that we're talking about now, you think about a 25 kilogram object being hit by an airplane, there's a very significant hazard to that aircraft. And so we need to understand and make sure that other people understand where to operate drones so that they don't interfere with your airport operations. And I've got some examples here where in Dubai, there were 3 separate occasions where the airspace had to be shut down completely. And Dubai is a very busy airport. And they estimated that there was something like 61 million dirham or 21 million Aussie dollars worth of impacts on A380s being diverted or circling around, waiting for the airspace to clear for them to use again following those closures. So how do we mitigate against those? We've got counter drone measures, and there are there's lots of work underway around the world creating counter drone operations. One of the examples that we know about close to home is the Black Knight UAV radar, and that can detect RPAs or UAVs and identify them to a relatively limited distance at the moment, but they're being trialled around the world and being utilised in certain circumstances. So they're being used for building protection and protecting critical infrastructure and identifying drones. So they can see and identify, but they can't do anything about those drones. The next example is a drone gun. Now we know that this one is being used during the Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast coming up by the Queensland Police Service, and they are operated by a human who can visually identify a drone and then use this device to prevent them from operating any further. These are just examples of the sort of technology that is available now and being used to combat drones. I'll take us further then. So what we were talking about up till now is, can we use drones and how do we prevent their use in inappropriate ways around airports? On a broader scale, some of the issues that are being grappled with by larger organisations and in particular local governments or state governments is how to attract investment to take advantage of the work that's underway in the drone industry around the world. And some of the things that we know about Australia is that we have a lot of open space where people don't live, and that's attractive to larger operators to carry out trials and tests and evaluation of drones that don't meet the standard operating conditions, if you like, or aren't able to be certified and meet their worthiness requirements of our regulations. And that's what Boeing is doing in Queensland, subject to finding a suitable site, and that work is underway at the moment. We also know that councils or other government organisations are desperately working hard to try and attract investment to operate drones in all sorts of different ways, whether it's drone racing or, for example, the World Drone Challenge, which seeks to allow competitors to fly from point to point and carry a certain weight and operate a certain distance to try and demonstrate the increase in endurance and capacity of those drones. And we also know that everyone thinks drones are a great idea, and they're progressively working through the benefits that can be derived from their use, whether it's a council or whether it's to invest or to seek investment by commercial businesses. And so this is just a bit of a checklist, and it's pretty high level at this stage, rather than go into the detail of it. But to go through a process which we're supporting some councils around Australia on at the moment, we need to understand what sort of site is required and evaluate the benefits or disadvantages of that site for the use by drones. Remember that drones don't necessarily only have vertical facing rotors, if you like. They can have forward facing rotors, and for example, there are large RPAs like the Global Hawk or even smaller drones that have wheels and need to roll on a pavement. So we don't always think of a drone operating like a helicopter off a landing pad. We're talking about larger RPAs that might need a runway of some description to operate. We also know that we need to make sure that there is a low obstacle environment so that they don't run into trees or buildings or towers, just the same as other aircraft. And one of the key issues in terms of infrastructure and services is that there is a high-speed internet connection. That's a critically important requirement for investment, because we know that in general drones are being used for capturing data, and that data needs to be transferred somewhere, and the only way to do that economically is via a very high-speed broadband connection. And there are other services like power and water or whatever other requirements might be applicable to the operation, just as you would for any other investment. We also know there are approvals requirements, and they would be through the Civil Aviation Safety Authority for the drone operation, or it might be in terms of planning requirements through development applications or other approvals. Then once we've worked out what the proponent wants to do and how to get the approvals, you would prepare a cost estimate for all of the work that needs to be done, prepare a financial plan and identify what financial benefits might accrue, and produce a cost-benefit analysis, particularly for investment that requires some sort of funding or grant. We work out how that investment or how the opportunity can be delivered, whether that's through a public-private partnership or private investment or ownership by the organisation proposing it, and then seeking funding options and grant opportunities and carrying out a risk assessment. And once all that has been done and you've validated the opportunity and decided that you want to ask for people's money to invest in, you can take it forward to implementation. And so just general principles applicable to implementing anything. You would have a plan, you would have some sort of investment attraction strategy, and that would include selling whatever the investment attraction might be. Go and seek the approvals that were necessary, and then enter the procurement and construction and operations activities at the end of that process. So if I just roll back and I'll just summarise that again, because I think it's really important, and we're seeing that this has been grappled with. There are lots of people with great ideas, but they need to eventually translate into spending people's money for some sort of benefit. And it all starts with what is the scope of operations and what does the operator need to be able to operate those drones, what infrastructure is required, and specifically high-speed broadband. Work out what the approval requirements are and produce a cost estimate and a financial plan and a risk assessment, and make a decision. And at the end of that process, if the decision is to progress it, then we go into implementation. It sounds easy when it's written out like that, but there's actually quite a rigorous process. And in going through that process, it's generally easy to find all the problems and identify the solutions, and then it's just a challenge to put those solutions into practice and fund them. So if I was to summarise what we've been talking about today, we know that technology is advancing incredibly fast in the drone industry. Drones are becoming safer. They're more readily available, even in the shopping centres. We've got DJI selling drones and having little places where people can play with them and get used to how they operate. We know that they're becoming more and more suitable for commercial purposes because of their range and endurance is increasing and the technology available. We know that they're great for airport operators, providing approvals can be gained to operate them from the regulator. We know that there are risks and hazards, and particularly where drones are operated by non-informed and non-aerodrome people. And there are countermeasures available. And in terms of attracting investment, whether it's on the airport or near the airport or to a particular location, there's a process to go through to identify a feasible investment and a strategy to attract and implement that investment opportunity. So today we were going to talk about what is a drone, and we've covered all sorts of different ideas. We talked about some of the capabilities, and some of those can only be dreamed about now, but we know that anything can happen in the future. We talked about current operational requirements and limitations, what are the opportunities and what are the risks and hazards and countermeasures associated with drone operations. And we talked about feasibility and implementation. Now I've got some questions here, if I'll just go quickly through them. In terms of emergency services, we know that emergency services can operate drones, not necessarily requiring an approval, subject to their type of operation. And I've got a question here, the legal implications of intercepting a drone with a drone gun. I don't know the answer to that question, but if anyone else who's listening or watching has some input, I'd be happy to take that. And there's a question from someone who's asked if we wanted to use a basic DJI drone for runway inspections, what would need to be done to use this? And then it would need to be operated in accordance with the Part 101 requirements. And the aerodrome operator ideally would prepare a risk assessment and apply to CASA to operate that drone for that purpose. I've got a question. What was the question around the drone gun? And that was, what are the legal implications of intercepting a drone with a device such as a drone gun? So I'll take any answers if anyone wants to come forward with an answer to that. And I'm seeing there that people are saying it's illegal as it interferes with aircraft operations. And generally speaking, if you're going to use a device that interferes with electromagnetic radiation in one way or another, then you would need a very specific approval. So generally, it wouldn't be a good idea to go and buy a drone gun and start firing it at drones or other people. I think that's coming through loud and clear that to drone or jam, that you need a specific authority to do that. I don't think I have any other points or questions. So, if there's nothing else, then I'm happy to sign off, and I'll leave that to David to finalise the discussion.
Okay, there are no other questions from members. Anything else coming through? So there's no other. If there's any other questions that come through just while I'm thanking Keith, then he can interject and answer that if he feels the need to. So thank you, Keith, for a great presentation and an overview into drones. It's obviously very complex, but something which is becoming more and more relevant to airport operators. And again, thanks to everybody that has participated in the session today. These sessions obviously are as good as the members who take the time to join us on the webinars and participate with questions, etc. So again, thank you very much to everybody for participating. We'd like to now ask you to take a moment to complete the short survey that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. Please ensure that you hit the orange submit button once you've completed all the questions. This webinar will be made available to members via the Airport Professional webinar page in the coming week. And we encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered by emailing events@airports.asn.au. I'd also like to let you know the next webinar will be on sprayed ceiling for airports, presented by Greg White. The link to register was distributed, will be distributed next week by Redback and will be advertised in next week's alert. If you would like additional information, please email the AAA events team at events@airports.asn.au. Today's webinar recording will be available next week in alert and emailed to everyone directly once available. Is there anything else, Keith, that's come through that you'd like to comment on?
Yes, David, I'm just seeing a couple of questions or comments that have come through. One of the questions has come from someone that operates a mining aerodrome with leased land. That's probably something that we can take offline if that person wants to contact me directly by the contact details, and we can talk about that further. And the other question was, do we facilitate operations? Aviation Projects doesn't operate drones. We work more towards the operational approvals and airspace use aspect of drone operations rather than the operations themselves.
Okay, fantastic. So that looks as though Keith has addressed the comments or questions. His contact information is obviously on the screen there as well, so if there's anything else, feel free to contact him directly. And again, thank you very much, Keith, for the webinar, and thanks everybody for your participation. We'll sign off there and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.